European history is a massive and incredibly important part of human history. A significant part of its history was the colonisation of the so-called New World, the Americas and the Indies. In modern times, people have begun to view these parts of our history in a negative manner on the basis of racist oppression of native peoples in America, Africa, Australia, New Zealand and the Indies. I would like to look at the history of colonisation in my own homeland of Australia, focusing on the lack of primary sources that would indicate any level of intentional oppression or hatred towards the Aboriginal peoples of New South Wales. The man most often accounted as having discovered Australia is Captain James Cook. Captain Cook was a British navigator and explorer who used his incredible knowledge of mathematics and sailing to discover and claim for His Majesty islands in the continent of Australia. While it is somewhat accurate to credit him with the discovery of Australia, it is very similar to Christopher Columbus. Columbus was not the first European man to land in America. Some 400 years earlier, the Viking explorer Leif Erikson landed in modern-day Newfoundland, Canada. Similarly, many men had landed in Australia for hundreds of years before Captain Cook. These were primarily Dutch traders and colonisers working for the Dutch East India Company. However, they never made any significant attempts at colonisation or exploration before Captain Cook. He was the man who opened Australia to the world. Much could be said about Captain James Cook. He was a poor farmer who rose to the ranks of the British Navy, but it is not necessary for our current discussion. Captain Cook embarked on his voyage to the mythical land of Terra Australis Incognita, New Holland as it was known by the Europeans at that time. His voyage consisted of only one ship, the HMS Endeavour. It had a crew of 94 men when it sailed from dock in Plymouth on the 26th of August 1768. Captain Cook kept an extensive diary, as most captains of his time did, in which he wrote of his beliefs about Australia. He doubted the theories of the Portuguese navigator Pedro Fernandes de Queiroz. He was of the belief that there was no significant Australian continent. Land was, without a doubt, found south of the island of Papua, though no one had been able to circumnavigate this land and prove its size. He wrote, just a few days before sighting land, and I quote, "The track of the Endeavour has demonstrated that the land seen by these persons, a few aforementioned Dutch and Spanish navigators, and supposed to be part of a continent is not so." End quote. On the 31st of March, Lieutenant Hicks of the HMS Endeavour sighted land. Captain Cook named the small outcrop of Victoria Point Hicks after the lieutenant. This sighting was the most important and significant part of Australian history, laying down the tracks for the sake of the colonisation of this continent. For the next 3 weeks, the Endeavour followed north along the coast of the modern-day states of Victoria and New South Wales. Captain Cook noted the number of sightings of the Aboriginals of New South Wales. He attempted to land alongside Dr. Joseph Banks, his botanist, Tupia, a Polynesian navigator who Dr. Banks was fond of, and also Dr. Daniel Solander, a Swedish-born naturalist. He wanted to make peaceful contact with a group of Aboriginals he saw on the coast, though they fled as soon as they saw him coming. He wrote, "We determined, however, to go ashore and endeavoured to procure an interview, but in this we were again disappointed. The waves along the coast were too strong, preventing him from landing and pursuing the Aboriginals." This all occurred on the night of the 28th of April. When daylight came, they discovered a bay which they used to shield from the winds. The crew of the HMS Endeavour took refuge within this bay, allowing Captain Cook and his men to land on the shores of New South Wales for the first time. I find the captain's recounting of events to be sufficient on their own to showcase the honour with which he viewed these primitive peoples. So I quote, "We intended to land where we saw the people, and began to hope that as they had so little regard of ships coming into the bay, they would show as little regard for our coming on shore. In this, however, we were disappointed. For as soon as we approached the rocks, 2 of the men came down upon them to dispute our landing, and the rest ran away. Each of the 2 champions was armed with a lance about 10 feet long and a short stick, which he seemed to handle as if it was a machine to assist him in managing or throwing the lance. They called to us in a very loud tone and in a harsh, dissonant language, for which neither we nor Tupia understood a single word. They brandished their weapons and seemed resolved to defend their coast to the uttermost, though there were but 2 and we were 40. I could not but admire their courage, and being very unwilling that hostilities should commence with such inequality of force between us, I ordered the boat to lie upon her oars. We then parleyed by signs for about a quarter of an hour, and to bespeak their goodwill, I threw them nails, beads, and other trifles, which they took up and seemed to be well pleased with. I then made signs that I wanted water, and, by all means that I could devise, endeavoured to convince them that we would do them no harm. They now waved to us, and I was willing to interpret it as an invitation, but upon our putting the boat in, they came again to oppose us. One appeared to be a youth about 19 or 20, and the other a man of middle age. As I had now no other resource, I fired a musket upon them. Upon the report, the youngest dropped a bundle of lances upon the rock, but recollecting himself in an instant, he snatched them up again with great haste. A stone was then thrown at us, upon which I ordered a musket to be fired with small shot, which struck the eldest upon the legs, and he immediately ran to one of the houses which was distant about 100 yards. As soon as he came back, he threw a lance at us, and his comrade another. They fell where we stood thickest, but happily hurt nobody. A third musket with small shot was then fired at them, upon which one of them threw another lance and immediately ran away. And I end quote. He then went to their abandoned house and left in some beads, ribbons, cloth, and other such presents in the hope that it might gain their favour, though he took with him the spears, the lances which they had dropped. Captain Cook spent 8 days within that bay, exploring it and trying to parley with the Aboriginals. When he left, he named it Botany Bay for the great number of interesting and beautiful flora and fauna specimens they had collected from it. A few months later, while navigating the eastern coast, Captain Cook declared the continent New South Wales, after the marshy and hilly Wales of the United Kingdom, and claimed the land for His Majesty. During Captain Cook's stay in Australia, he made many peaceful meetings with the native peoples. He learnt as much of their language as possible and incessantly offered them gifts of beads, clothing, and metal goods. I believe Captain Cook's personal writings prove very well that neither he nor his compatriots aboard the HMS Endeavour felt anything but compassion for the peoples of Australia. He frequently lamented the poor living standards of the Aboriginals. They neither wore clothing nor had houses. He remarked that their huts and their canoes were some of the worst he had ever seen. I think the previous engagement and a few other unfortunately hostile encounters show how much Captain Cook cared for maintaining peace with the Aboriginals at all costs. The British never, during this first voyage, attacked the Aboriginals. Captain Cook would continue his career of exploration, where he did not head the expedition that established the first British colony in Australia. That would be undertaken by a man of different expertise. Captain Arthur Phillip was appointed first Governor of New South Wales. He was given orders for the establishment of a convict settlement in Botany Bay, and 11 ships were constructed for this purpose. 200 Royal Marines were appointed for this voyage, 40 of whom brought their wives and children. Alongside them, 81 freedmen and 696 convicts were volunteered or appointed to be sent to Botany Bay. There were in total 1,044 people set to join the First Fleet, as it is commonly called, with one freedman, soldier, or civil servant per every convict. 1,030 of these men lived for the voyage and safely arrived in Australia. There is a commonly prevailing belief amongst Australians that a significant number of the convicts sent to Australia were simple thieves and pickpockets who had resorted to crime out of the need to feed themselves, and this belief is somewhat accurate. Of the 696 convicts, only 55 had been given sentences of 7 years or longer. The vast majority of those sent to Australia would be freed after only 2 or 3 years. They weren't trying to kill off all of their convicts or anything, they were instead trying to send those who were not really that deserving of prison, but still couldn't be allowed in common society, to a place where they would be given an extra chance. Captain Phillip was a well-educated man of German and English descent. He was well-educated in various fields, language, music, agriculture, and had served in the Navy since he was 16 years old, 34 years by the time of the First Fleet. The First Fleet departed from England on the 13th of May, 1787. On the 18th of January the following year, he anchored in Botany Bay, 17 years after Captain Cook. Captain Phillip, mirroring Captain Cook, landed peacefully on the shores of Botany Bay. The Aborigines on the shore immediately threw down their arms and happily met the British, who offered them gifts of peace. This is largely due to the fact that Captain Phillip landed himself on the shore, unarmed and alone, to meet these people. He certainly did not think them violent or savage. Captain Phillip decided that Botany Bay would not be adequate for a colony of any significance. The bay was simply too small and too shallow. He thus moved, on the 23rd of January, the fleet to Port Jackson, further north. He found this area to be far more agreeable and named the bay Sydney Cove for the Viscount of Sydney, who was also head of the Colonial Office. The same events that Captain Cook saw in Botany Bay again occurred in Sydney Cove. The Aboriginals were at first suspicious of the Europeans, but Captain Phillip tactfully subjugated them and landed peaceably. The Aboriginals, and especially the elder of their tribe, were quick to trust the governor. Some 20 of the Aborigines even endeavoured to swim to the anchored fleet of 11 ships unarmed. Captain Phillip was impressed with these people, so much so that he named that beach Manly Cove, for their heroic displays of masculinity in the face of better equipped people. They dined together that evening on the coast, when Captain Phillip drew a line in the sand, showing them that the land that he claimed for England and the land which he allowed them to keep. The Aboriginals acquiesced to this. Unfortunately, these peaceful interactions were soon to be jeopardised. Captain Cook and the British government did not follow in the footsteps of the Dutch explorers, keeping their discoveries low-key and unknown on the international stage. 2 ships, flying the French colours, were spotted by some of the British who had remained at Botany Bay. These ships, under the command of Monsieur de la Pérouse, anchored in the bay. They peacefully cooperated with the British, landing on the cove. At one moment, certain convicts on the coast attempted to gain entry to the French ships, hoping to flee from justice, but Monsieur Pérouse refused them entry to his ships. Interestingly, the French buried one of the first Europeans in Australia. A Father Le Recouvier had been mortally wounded by some natives on the Navigators Islands. He seemed to have healed before the French arrived in Australia, but then suddenly died while they were in harbour. He was buried in Botany Bay, where he remains to this day. He, being a Catholic priest, is now often visited by pilgrims from Sydney. The French had some unfortunate conflicts with the Aboriginals around Botany Bay, and the gravestone of the father was at one point destroyed. At the same time, Captain Phillip had begun clearing trees in Sydney Cove. He laid out a preliminary plan for the construction of a city and built some temporary tents and storage sheds. On the 7th of February 1788, the first parts of the New South Wales government were established, courts were created, and proclamations read aloud. The Union Jack was raised and a 300 volley fired to celebrate the official establishment of a Sydney Cove colony. He exclaimed to the soldiers words of gratitude, to the colonists promises to punish crime swiftly and without mercy, and to all of them his great desire to create, to the glory of God Almighty and for the honour of England, a great and glorious colony. It was after this that the first signs of difficulty in cooperation between the whites and the Aborigines was first encountered. The British were unfamiliar with the land and the animals, and quickly wild animals became scarce. The British and the Aborigines suffered as a result of this. Governor Phillip tried his hardest to ensure that his people would be able to coexist alongside the Aborigines, but this was difficult. For now though, the Aborigines were content in struggling for their own food and leaving the British to themselves. Captain Hunter, who was captain of one of the ships of the fleet, wrote extensively on his thoughts about the Aborigines. He viewed them incredibly favourably, supposing them to be an intelligent people, good in character and in physical ability. These views were shared by Governor Phillip. Whenever the British, using their ships and fishing nets, managed to gain a particularly successful bounty of fish, Governor Phillip ensured that some portion of those fish were distributed amongst the Aborigines. 'Twas in May of 1788 that the first murder occurred within the colony. 2 prisoners went out into the bush and both were attacked by Aborigines. One of them died in the bush, while the other managed to return to the camp to be treated in the hospital. A few days later, 2 other men were killed while working in the bush. This place is today called Rushcutters Bay after those 2 men. It was later ascertained that these men likely brought this fate upon themselves. One Aboriginal was killed and another wounded by these prisoners. Thus, no action was made against the Aborigines and peace was maintained. By August, the first brick buildings were erected: a hospital, barracks, observatory, and a house for the governor and one for the lieutenant governor. It was also at this point that conflict with the Aborigines was mounting. On the 21st of August, without any provocation, a group of Aboriginal men attacked the people working at the observatory. They killed them and stole off with a goat. This was in a time when the livestock of the colony was not yet able to reproduce in great numbers. The loss of even one goat was a great public misfortune. Despite this, no retaliation was made against the Aborigines. In July, the Aborigines attempted to do the same once more, but they were beat back by the men appointed to watch over the livestock. It was after this that it could be said a state of war existed between the 2 peoples. Deaths came on an almost daily basis on both sides. The British simply could not allow for these attacks to continue. If ever any British went out into the bush in search of food, as many of the gluttonous convicts were wont to do, they were almost always killed. Governor Phillip had to, for their own good, enforce a strict punishment of 150 lashes if any man strayed too far from the colony. Though very often the convicts were so weak they were unable to endure all 150 of the lashes and would instead receive about half, get put in hospital, and then receive the other half when they were released. I would like to leave this episode here. I think I've made it abundantly clear that the British government, the explorers, and most of the people directly involved in the colonisation process of Australia were not at all racist. They viewed the Aborigines as an unfortunately disadvantaged people who were in need of European civilization, but not as an inferior race that needed exterminating or controlling. They struggled for as long as they could to establish and maintain peaceful cooperation with the Aborigines, and it was only due to a lack of communication between the two peoples that they came into bitter conflict. If anyone is interested, I can certainly continue this idea, and I will leave links in the description or pinned comment of links to the actual excerpts from Captain Cook's journal, which he kept, and transcripts of them. Being an Australian of British descent, this is a piece of history near and dear to me, and I despise the falsehoods and lies we are today fed about our ancestors, so I will very likely continue this.